Hey, deserving listeners, we've had podcast episodes before in which we talked about paraphilias, in which people exhibit preference or compulsions for sadomasochism or voyeurism or exhibitionism, other kinds of, and then it can get a little darker, like wanting to actually harm other people while having sex. And we talked about them in detail, but what we didn't get to is perhaps why we evolved these things, because it's hard to nail that down. But I thought we would have Yuval Laor on the podcast since he is an expert on these sorts of things. Welcome to the podcast, Yuval.
Thank you for having me.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. Yuval, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Yuval Laor. I live in Colorado, in Boulder, and I have a PhD in culture studies, which I wrote about the evolution of the capacity for fervor and awe and religious conversion. And right now I'm turning that into a book. So,
what will the book be called?
Well, the current title is either The Infatuated Primate or The Awe-Inspired Primate. So
the episode today is about the sexual perverted primate. So help us understand that.
We need to situate that within a context. So let me start by introducing a thing called sexual imprinting, which is in animals. Primarily, we see it in birds, but it probably exists in many mammals as well. And sexual imprinting, like other types of imprinting, means that there is a sensitive period in development when the bird will decide, or it's not that it's conscious, but the bird will determine who it is that she wants or he wants to have sex with.
Yeah, it's similar to the more well-known phenomenon of some birds imprinting on who is their mother that they're going to follow around. So
yeah,
I think most people know that if you are there at a particular time for a young bird and you're giving food and you're giving warmth and attention, then that bird will imprint on you and believe that you're the bird's mother or, some version of that, and will follow you around just like they would follow around their mother of the same species.
Yeah.
So or saying that there's a similar process for sexual preference.
Yes. So if you take an egg of one species and you put it into the nest of another species, there are certain species that will, as they grow up, they will become sexually interested in the species that was adopted them. So that's the mother and siblings that raised them, probably a father as well, and not be imprinted on their own species.
Interesting.
Yes. And it's another example of imprinting that people are familiar with is phobias. So you have a tendency for a phobia, but then around age 5, if you're scared of spiders, you'll become arachnophobic. If you're scared of heights, you'll become, right? So right. It is a strange combination of nature and nurture. It's neither nature nor nurture. It is a nature program that says take information from the environment and incorporate that.
Right. And it makes sense, right? Because it's a more flexible system that allows a organism to adapt to the reality of their life once being born, rather than being rigidly programmed, so to speak, to one instinct.
Yeah. Well, sometimes, yeah. So this would be a selection for plasticity. In this case, a very specific type of plasticity. But sometimes you don't want it, right? So the cuckoo who is raised in another nest, you don't want the cuckoo to be imprinted on its adoptive family, but on other cuckoos, right?
Right.
So sometimes it's adaptive and sometimes it's not. Yeah.
It's fine for it to be raised by the other birds, but in order to reproduce, it has to be sexually, driven towards other cuckoos.
Yeah. Now, today they do say that the mother cuckoo visits with the baby periodically. So it's more complicated. But it seems like we have sexual imprinting in humans. And I'm not the first one to say this. The first one to say this is a woman called Hannah Aronson, and she wrote her PhD about this. And she also wrote a chapter in a book called Maladapting Minds. So, but there are certain things that it is that I will add that she doesn't mention. So one of those things is that we notice a huge increase in sexual variability around the 18th century, right?
Okay.
So the Marquis de Sade is, right, late 18th century. And
in Western culture, yeah?
Yeah, only in the West.
Yeah.
Maybe Japan, but I'm not sure what's going on there. But before that, we don't really see, I mean, there are sort of strange anecdotes in the ancient world of, people having sex with animals, but, the Kama Sutra is very different than the 50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah.
Right? So it seems like the increase in variability in sexuality coincided when humans started hiding sexuality from children and when privacy became a thing.
Interesting. I thought about that. Yeah, it makes sense.
Yes. So normally, forever, kids always saw people having sex around them, right? And privacy is surprisingly recent.
Yeah, because in the 99.9% of people lived in very small homes that didn't afford different rooms for different people, and there would be 12 children, and you couldn't avoid at least occasionally viewing or hearing or having some awareness of the way that your parents, when your parents were having sex and the way they were, or your older siblings, or maybe even just other people in the village or something. There was just a lot less privacy, right?
Yeah, and actually there was no privacy, and there was no concept of privacy really for the masses. If you go to Versailles, for example, the hallway goes through the rooms. There is you can't. The rooms are connected in a way that you have to walk through the rooms because they don't need privacy,
right?
And they don't think about it. But once you have privacy and once you start hiding sexuality from children, which accelerates it's maybe among aristocrats in the 18th century, which is the Marquis de Sade, but 19th and 20th century it becomes more and more common, of course, in the West.
Why did they start doing that?
So that's part of Victorian morality, and it comes with a certain interpretation of Christianity about children being pure. Right? Children sometimes are good, sometimes are bad, and they were thinking of sexuality as something bad, which also they change back and forth. But there was a coinciding of seeing children as good and sexuality as bad, and so they needed to protect children from sexuality. I'm not an expert on this history, but that's my understanding.
But the Victorian cultural movement, shall we say, is a well-known cultural phenomenon in the West.
Yes, and they stopped talking about sexuality altogether, right?
Yeah.
Not especially with children, but in polite company.
Right.
So, as coinciding with the hiding of sexuality from children do not are not able to be imprinted on the sexual act, right?
Meaning that we evolved to have plasticity around being imprinted by seeing other people have sex. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, or even knowing about sex. I mean, there are kids today who do not know. I mean, that do not know what the genitals of the opposite sex look like until they're late teens.
Right.
It's so you obviously would not be able to imprint on that if your sensitive period is 4, 5, 6, 7, which is
right.
Now, there are reasons to believe that around age 6, something happens regarding sexual imprinting, because when you set up a couple to marry each other, an arranged marriage, and you meet the husband and the wife when they're 6-year-olds, they will not be attracted to each other.
Right.
When they're 8-year-old, 9-year-old, they will, or they might, right?
Yeah.
But before that, it seems like they would treat each other like siblings. So they will not be sexually attracted, but it seems around age 6 or something around there, something regarding that kind of sexual imprinting happens. So it could be that other types of sexual imprinting, and I'm going to talk about 2 or 3 separate imprintings that take place. So first of all, and this might or might not have anything to do with imprinting, but that's sexual orientation, right?
Yeah.
So we know that if identical twins, one of them is homosexual, the chance that the other one would be homosexual is 50%.
Right.
So that's a lot bigger than random, but also not 100%. So it could be that there is some element of imprinting, but it's probably not.
Yeah.
No, the other 2 types of imprinting is one of them is what is the sexual act, right? What do you want to do with a member of the opposite sex or the same sex? Right. And that is where you get all the paraphilia, right?
Yeah.
And it's a huge variety, right?
Yeah, and I should say that in my episodes on paraphilia, the whole concept is problematic in my view, particularly as it's laid out in the DSM-5, because there are some things that most of us can decide, most of us would agree, that should be identified as pathology, like the pleasure in harming other people while having sex, which leads people to wanting to rape people to have their sexual needs met. This is harmful, it's obvious, and it's we could deem it as pathological, particularly if it's something that they can't really control or can't be adjust to. But in the same chapter, there are other things like sadomasochism, for example. No, I'm trying to remember there's like 9 of them. I'm trying to remember. I should have read up on it. But do you know the paraphilias that are in the DSM?
Not the DSM. I have here a book called "Who's Been Sleeping in Your Head: The Secret World of Sexual Fantasies" by Brett Carr, Kahr, where she does a big survey.
Okay.
So I can read you from the table of contents. So he has 3 orgies. Okay. There's cheating, right? There's people who want to cheat or want to be cheated on.
Yeah.
There's fantasies of celebrities. There's exhibitionism, fetishism, transvestism,
right. So transvestism, right? That's just dressing up as in a way that, culturally speaking, is expressive of another gender, and to call that, pathological is, I think, highly problematic.
But isn't in the DSM? I thought that it's only described as a problem if someone has a problem with it. If someone sees it as a problem.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, the reason why it's a problem is because society sees it as a problem.
Yeah.
The fact that I dress up, quote unquote, as a masculine person, I don't have a problem with that, because no one bullies me or ridicules me or tries to kill me or thinks I'm a bad person because I'm dressing, quote unquote, in the cultural, decidedly way that men are supposed to dress. So, of course, if I dressed as a woman, then a good portion of society is going to treat me badly, some overt and some covert ways. And so to say that just because there's because the problem that they say is, a problem at home, school, or work or something, right? Okay. And it's like, if I dressed up as a woman at home, school, and work, there would be problems. I would feel ashamed. I would be oppressed. I would, if I dressed as
ridiculed.
if I dressed as a man, I would have less problems. So you see the problem there, right? It's like putting those together, dressing as a culturally as the other gender or some other expressive way, in the same paragraph or, chapter as fantasizing and wanting and actually raping other people, I just find to be really problematic, because raping other people and the harm there is not a cultural aspect. We definitely do ostracize and stigmatize and oppress people who rape people, but I think most of us would say that's okay.
Of course. And pedophiles, even if they don't rape people.
Right. Well, so that's a whole other conversation in terms of pedophilia versus sexual molestation, right? You have people who think or fantasize about having sex with, and I didn't realize there was a whole debate until I started talking about this on the podcast, that there are people, there's a political movement, so to speak, of people who are pedophiles. They fantasize or have a preference for having sex with some younger age of person. It could be 11-year-olds or 5-year-olds or whatever, and they never act on it. And they say that there's nothing wrong with them having the fantasy. People have fantasies about raping people or about being raped. And most people, once they wrestle with the implications and learn that there are people out there who just fantasize and never do anything with it, could agree that we shouldn't throw them in jail or call them nasty words, as long as they're not harming other people, and they're not buying porn that exploits other people, all that kind of stuff. Then, many people agree that they shouldn't be pathologized. And so anyway, whereas in our culture of, we're still probably half Victorian, we just label all of that as problematic and gross and perverted and amoral and against nature
and illegal in some cases.
Right.
So we were talking about the imprinting regarding the sexual act.
Right.
And it seems that might not be changeable. And this is studies done on pedophiles. Because there are some imprintings that are changeable. For example, phobias, right? You can cure phobias. But it seems that you cannot cure pedophilia or change it.
I guess in the same way, that we can't change the way you feel about your mother, for example. If your mother was there for you, breastfeeding you or feeding you and holding you, and from the time you're born until you're 3, there's a certain feeling that we all have around our mothers or father, whoever it was that, one or more people who really were there for us during that time. It's a special imprinting bond that children and, adults will have towards their parents.
And it includes sexual repulsion, things like that.
What do you mean?
No, you're not attracted to your mother.
Right. Yeah. And we have tried to change that sometimes, because you'll have kids who have their parents die, for example, when they're 2, or their parents give them up for adoption, or they're in an orphanage early in life, and then age 2, they go into a family. And what we find is that critical window for imprinting is gone, has passed, and the person never really attaches in a healthy way to those other adults, no matter how wonderful and loving they are. I specialized in this in the beginning of my career. For some reason, I had a lot of Korean adoptees in America, and I think it's because I'm half Asian, so they thought, well, he's an Asian guy, so maybe he connects with Asian adoptive parents or adoptive kids. So a lot of Korean kids adopted into white families, and I learned over time, over working with dozens of people, that I could predict the level of defiance and difficulty with the teenager based on at what age the Korean kid was adopted into the family. So if the kid was adopted at day, say, like 90, 3 months, then the dysfunction would be a lot less than if the kid was adopted after 1.5 years.
Yeah.
And past like 1.5 years adopted into the family, the dysfunction would be tremendous. The attachment problems, the lying, the defiance, the lack of motivation to please any authority figure, the drug use, the criminal behavior was just, it was just off the charts for a lot of these kids. Not that all kids are doomed, if they're adopted, but
and also it depends on what happens to them and before they were adopted. So if they did have a loving family, it might not be as bad as if
exactly.
They did.
Right. For some reason, if I remember right, in Korea there were actual orphanages with nurses who have shifts and don't necessarily bond with one child.
Yeah.
And I worked with other adoptees too. It's not just Korean kids. It would be like kids from the old Yugoslavia or something like that. It was the same thing. But anyway, so there's a critical window for sexual preference that you're getting.
Or a sensitive period. I think it's sometimes referred to.
Okay, sensitive period.
Yeah, where you are. Where you.
And you're saying is it 0 to 7 or is it like 4 to 7?
I would guess maybe 3 to 7, but again, this is just guesses.
Right. Well, that's consistent with so it's interesting that you're bringing this up, at the beginning of the podcast. I'm like, we didn't talk about, but now that I remember hypothesizing in a much less, evidence-based manner, and technical manner, what you're talking about. Because in my experience, personally and professionally, the time between, say, usually around 4 or 5, 6 years old, maybe a little older, if you experience so tell me if this is correct or not in terms of how the theory goes. Because I was talking about foot fetish, and the story or the possible story that I talked about was you're 4 years old and you're small and you're playing on the ground with your Legos and you might even be under the table playing, and your mom has her friend over and you're under the table, and because we're in a Victorian, I guess I didn't include this part of it of like, because the
lack of sexual,
right, because the 4-year-old is not being exposed to missionary, naked missionary, visuals,
penetration,
right? There's this lack of anything related to sex in terms of the way it's that way, and so he is open to input, and so he sees this foot, and it is at least ancillarily, if that's a word, related to sexuality, because the foot is related to the leg, which is related to the vagina, right? And so for this young boy, if he was born with the predisposition for heterosexuality, then because he has no access to vagina or visual of vagina, this foot is like a close enough a version to what his body is set up to imprint. I didn't use the word imprint. And so he looks at this foot and he gets this sexual charge at the age of 4. He doesn't know what it means. He doesn't think of it as sex, but he gets a jolt of energy looking at this foot. And that imprint, and then kind of rinse and repeat that experience, like 3 weeks later, he sees the same woman with her foot and he gets another charge from it. Well, that might develop into an adult fetish of feet, where in order to have an erection or an orgasm, somehow fantasizing about feet or high heel shoes, or even being in contact with feet in high heel shoes, is the only way, or one of his preferred ways. Am I saying this right?
Yes, but there is another imprinting that we need to discuss about, and that is who the foot is connected to. So you can say that the one imprinting regards the sexual act, but then another imprinting regarding the type of person. So, for example, if
like a white woman, or
or a woman with large breasts, or with small breasts, or tall,
right.
or so you might be interested in let's say voyeurism, but you're separately imprinted on the type of person you want to be voyeuristic with.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And this, the sort of obvious evidence of all of this to me is various different intense fetishes that people will have, men and women, for things that have nothing to do with our species, a couple 100,000 years ago,
Yeah.
like panty or high heel shoes, for example, or panties, right? We didn't have panties, even just until recently, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and other kinds of, other kinds of things like that. Like some people get turned on by guns.
Mm-hmm.
They have a sexual association with, assault rifles or something, and or with dressing like the other quote unquote gender. Even just 150 years ago, the way that quote unquote men and quote unquote women dressed in our Western society was completely different, and so today you have people who will be turned on by playing with those gender associations, and the only way, and since it's so visceral and biological, right? I mean, there's nothing more biological than sexuality, right? I mean, having an erection or having sexual arousal in your genital region is a biological thing, and for many people, largely out of our control. And so why would panties or dressing as another gender or high heel shoes be the primary focus if it weren't for imprinting, right?
That's right. Yeah. And it shows up at the right time. And it leads to a thing that Brett Carr in his book refers to as the masturbation paradox, which is people who are unhappy with their sexual desires. So they wish they didn't want that. They want not to want their own sexual desires. They would rather have another sexual desire. So it's a strange, well, he refers to it as the masturbation paradox. So
right. So I'm assuming what he's talking about is that as you become more lonely, you resort to masturbation because you don't have any other way of having a sexual.
No. So he talks about a woman who she's a Holocaust survivor, and she has Holocaust-themed fantasies that she only can orgasm when thinking about those, and she really wished she had other fantasies.
Right.
Yeah.
And because she masturbates and gets orgasmic visual pleasure from those
from things she wished she didn't,
it further associates those things she doesn't want to associate with sex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in Israel in the 1950s, there was pornographic magazine for which was Holocaust themed.
Interesting.
Called Stalag. Yeah.
Because you're 4 years old and you're in the camps, and
then when you're 20 in Israel in the 50s, you might be imprinted on camp Holocaust themed situations. Yeah.
What were the visuals in that? Like,
well, first of all, you can Google it and see, but it's cartoons, but sadomasochistic situations with scantily clad women and either dominant or submissive roles and things like that.
So I'm guessing that's pretty controversial that you would have survivors of the camps wanting pornography that involves the camps.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had never heard of that before. But yeah, if there's ever an example of imprinting, right?
Yes.
It totally goes against all your political and moral and socially acceptable mores, and yet people still did it.
Yeah, and those magazines sold apparently.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite tragic. Now, another way that this makes sense is within the context of evolvability. So, do you know you know what evolvability is?
Did we talk about that last time in terms
Maybe
of
I mentioned it.
like an openness to like the evolution of evolution or something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But evolvability, one of the things, there's a lot of things to it, but one of the things is that when things are good, you want to stay the same. You want the variation to be low.
Right.
Right. And when things are bad, you want to increase the variation.
Right.
Or when something has recently changed, you want the variation to increase. So a famous example is the 20th century domestication of foxes in the Soviet Union, where initially all the foxes looked the same, but those are silver foxes. But when they started selecting them for tameness or for lack of aggressivity, they suddenly you had a huge increase in the way they looked. So suddenly you had curly tail, and you had different colorations, and you have floppy ears and things like that. So because and this is a mechanism that increases evolvability or enhances evolvability, which is a timely increase in variation.
Yeah. And so the idea is that many organisms, if not all, have this mechanism that kicks in when there is a incursion on the environment somehow. In terms of it's hard not to use like problematic language, like the DNA detects a problem in the of course it's not true, but
it's the selection pressures change,
right, and somehow the DNA, there's a mechanism in a lot of DNA sequences that quote unquote detect that. It's not detecting, but it's some responds to it somehow to say like, okay, now variate in lots of ways, not just because we don't know exactly what variation is necessary to adapt to this environment, that increase the amount of mutations. This will
variation. Yeah.
Right. And so
also mutations that we see a lot in plants. I don't know how, I think there's also evidence in animals, but in plants, when they're stressed, as they're stressed, they're about to die, they mutate. So mutation is not random.
Right. And there always has to be a balance between the amount of mutations versus stability, because if you have too many mutations, then your species is likely to mutate too much.
If you evolve too fast, there can be a few horrible winters, and then you might forget something that it took you a million years to learn, right? But if you evolve too slow, then you evolve too slow, and you don't adapt. So there needs to be a balance. But one of the things that enhances this is a timely increase in variation. And what we see with sexual perversion is that there was an inheritance mechanism in place, that children saw people having sex, became imprinted on that, and that continued, right? From generation to generation. And at some point in the 18th, 19th century in the West, and I would guess that studies would tell us that people in certain third world countries that are still see sexuality as children, that they would not have as big a variability in the types of pornography that people there watch.
Right.
But in places like England, that you'll have huge variability.
Right.
So once you change this inheritance mechanism from generation to generation, and suddenly things have changed. And so it makes sense that as a response, there's a huge increase in variability.
Right.
So suddenly you have foot fetishists and all things like that, which, we would have, if a Roman emperor was into shoes or something, we probably would have heard of it.
Right.
But it is a modern phenomena, but it is a real phenomenon.
Well, it is interesting to think about. I mean, I'm a bit of a mildly ignorant or mostly ignorant amateur historian about Roman history, and there are some Roman emperors and generals who were at least reportedly to have had some interesting paraphilias.
Yeah, there are, and there's people who dress as women and things like that.
So you could, like Nero, for example. I mean, it's always, historians will say, like, it's hard to know if it was propaganda or not, but there's, at least some evidence that Nero and some other problematic emperors had paraphilias around rape and around killing people while having sex, or that
Caligula, probably.
Yeah. And it just popped in my head. And of course it's complete speculation, but during the time there were a lot of slaves, and it wasn't uncommon to have sex with slaves, and slaves were also routinely beaten and sometimes killed. And so I wonder if that's where the paraphilia comes from. It's like you're 4 years old and you're watching your dad or your uncles or your cousins or friends rape and kill slaves, and that produces a paraphilia around that.
Yeah, for sure. But still, even with that, they're not hardly as common as they are today, and certainly not among the general population, it seems.
Well, right. I mean, it would only in Roman society be for a very small percentage of the people in society, and it didn't show up very much anyway.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
And it might be also, stories that try to defame those people.
So, Yuval, is the recommendation that all children should watch their parents have sex?
Well, either their parents or certainly maybe the recommendation that they will see depictions of the opposite sex that are not photoshopped. A friend of mine, he grew up in Morocco, and he would go to baths, public baths with his mother until age 12. He would be around naked women, but those are real women. And today he's not attracted to thin women.
Right.
It's, he is, I don't know if that's good or bad for him, but we do have people who are imprinted on completely unnatural body forms, right?
Right. And porn in general is not, a typical depiction of actual sex.
Yeah, absolutely. So it could be that we should not only have, make sure that kids don't watch porn, but make sure they watch realistic sexual behavior. But of course, you cannot, in today's climate, you cannot suggest that. And
we could suggest it. We can't expect it.
Yeah.
But I think we can suggest it. But I mean, I can get behind that. I'll suggest it, that parents out there figure out some way of exposing children when they're young to depictions of bodies and of sexuality that is healthy, and not to think of it as somehow perverted or creating something bad for kids. It might actually
on
help
the other hand,
to develop normally.
You might have kids that grow up like that, and then they'll be the only vanilla kids, and all their friends would be, different kinds of perverts, and they will be the boring ones. So.
Well, that's interesting. It's like, that's interesting. I mean, I do talk with people who are in relationships, and they will need to have pornography. They both need pornography,
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if it's because of that imprinting when they were young.
It could be. There are also people whose sexual fantasies are impossible to fulfill.
Right.
There are people who are, attracted to humans who are the size of a Smurf,
Right.
and there are no people like that. And for that, I think either pornography or hypnosis is a possible solution.
Yeah. And, you're not saying the opposite of this, but it should be mentioned that fantasy is fine, that there's nothing wrong with,
Oh yeah, of course.
with fantasizing about Smurfs. You can fantasize people. I've done some recent episodes on fantasies about rape for both men and women, fantasizing about being raped and fantasizing about raping others. And I'd never really thought about it in depth before until I looked at the research, and it's something like half of women have, occasionally fantasized about being raped, and something like 10 or 15% regularly fantasize about it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet none of them would want to be raped, right? And then something like a third of men have fantasized at some point about raping women or men, and yet, so if a third of men have occasionally, and say 5% or something regularly fantasize about it, the percentage of men or people who actually rape other people, coercive sexual activity, it's pretty low. It happens a lot, and the few individuals who commit those crimes are abusing dozens, if not hundreds, of people, which creates this huge, problem in our society. But anyway, my point is that fantasizing about those things, as long as it stays fantasy, is totally fine. There's
and you can set up a role playing, a consensual non-consent kind of a thing.
Right. There's two kinds of rape fantasy, even just rape fantasy. There's the consensual rape fantasy and the non-consensual rape fantasy. The consensual rape fantasy is like she wants to, but she can't admit it. It's sort of like, an interesting statistic that I found in my research was that in the Harlequin novels, the romance novels that are predominantly consumed by women, I can't remember the exact stat, but it was something like 70% of these of the books have one or more scenes of rape, essentially what we would consider to be sexual assaults. And how, and similar to 50 Shades. I've never read 50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah,
was there non-consent, or was there sort of consensual-ish rape in 50 Shades of Grey? Do we know?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I assume. I'll tell you about 19th century pornographic novels that I read about. I haven't read any of them, but one of the recurring themes is that there is a woman, a virgin, and she gets kidnapped by the Sultan or something like that, and at the first time they have sex, he rapes her. And after that, she is into it.
Right.
So the taming of the shrew kind of a thing, where the first sexual experience for the woman is rape, but the next one she actually enjoys it. So it's a weird thing to see. And all of this, of course, is just in the West. I think these is pornography from England, but
right. The idea is that women in our society, and particularly in the past, were caught between a rock and a hard place, in that they had a normal sexual desire, but society said if they acted on that desire, or even had desire in them, that made them immoral, a slut, like a prostitute or something. And they didn't know what to do with that. So a way out was to be raped. And then you can say afterwards,
I didn't want to. Yeah,
I didn't want to do it. I tried to say no, but he's bigger, or had a scimitar to my throat. I couldn't say no. And then you can get some sexual pleasure from that. And so that's where, and a lot of the romance novels have that in it.
So the last thing I want to talk about is that if we are right, and Hannah Aronson is right, and this is sexual imprinting in humans, what that means is that your sexual fantasies do not mean much about you at all.
Right.
That they are not.
You're imprinting.
Yeah, and that you're not accountable for them.
Right.
And that it's not, because I think that
it's not a moral shortcoming. You're not a sick, perverted, terrible human being.
Yeah, and it's not, even if you have a fantasy of hurting people, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. But just in general, people, I think that people who do not understand why it is that they have this sexual fantasy, why are they, exhibitionists, or whatever it is that they're into, they can really feel a lot of guilt about it and have so there'll be a lot of second order problems that come from not understanding of that it's imprinting, but understanding it as imprinting, and from pedophilia, at least some of the imprinting is unchangeable. It's unclear whether it is or not.
There's this huge association, as most people know, that if you are sexually abused or exposed to that sort of thing as a young person, then your chances of being attracted to children later in life is increased, and therefore your chance of abusing children increases.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that makes total sense. And I did a whole episode on pedophilia as well, and there are other routes. Like one listener pointed out that for some people, it's that they are immature emotionally, and when they are developing as a teenager and having strong sexual urges, they don't feel comfortable with people their own age, and so their first sexual targets are people younger because they just feel more comfortable with younger people because emotionally they're on that level. But for other people who say you're 4 years old and a older cousin or an adult or somebody sexually abuses you, then you grow up and associate well, that's interesting. I mean, I guess the sort of direct correlation of a quote unquote fetish is people who like older people, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
they like to have sex with people who are or powerful people, or people who are in power over them or something.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that imprinting.
Yeah.
But what about
humiliate them?
But what about being imprinted with children? Would that be some sort of someone who's also a child that's having sex with, like a 8-year-old having sex with 7-year-old or something?
Yeah. So I'm not sure. It could be that that pedophilia specifically was something that you were exposed to as adult to child sexuality, but I don't know. And I it seems to me like pedophilia is pretty rare compared to some of the other fetishisms or paraphilias.
Yeah, it's hard to lock down.
It's hard to know.
People respond honestly.
And if it's surveys. Age 6, people won't remember.
Right.
Or might not remember.
Right.
And now so there's one problem is people not understanding themselves. And I think that can be a very difficult problem for some people. And the other problem is other people not understanding each other. So there are people who would justifiably complain that men are attracted to unnatural female beauty standards, right? And come and complain to the men, telling them that you should change. Now, it might be that if it's imprinting, then that generation is unchangeable. We can help the next generation, we can help put depictions of real-looking people for the next generation to see. But
it's a runaway feedback loop, because as you today have young, particularly younger men, just using heterosexual men as an example, being attracted to completely unrealistic female beauty standards, they end up consuming and creating a high demand for pornography that is like that, and even more, even more so like that. And then you like the handicap principle, so to speak,
Yeah.
the perfect pornography, depiction. And then you're a younger person, ready to be imprinted. And if 99.9% of pornography out there that is available to you to be randomly exposed to is of that nature, then you're
not even pornography, just regular media depictions of people.
Right, like advertisements or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so and then that creates the next generation who are imprinted on an even more unrealistic standard. Because one of the things that I think about sometimes when I think about this idea is that, and it's hard to, tell exactly because it's not a hard science, but like when you look at models in the 70s, they look more natural. I mean, there's a more natural sort of vibe to the 70s, because it was.
I mean, they have pubic hair in porn.
Yeah, and just frizzy hair, and just not so great skin, or not sort of the standard of today.
Well, they don't have the body makeup kind of stuff that
right.
assume they.
And obviously not Photoshop, right? Mm-hmm. And how they're. And so what a lot of people of today will look at that and they'll be like, gross.
Mm-hmm.
Just look at, the models of the 70s, men and women, and they'll just be like, ew, that's so gross. And like male chest hair,
mm-hmm.
was huge in the 70s and 80s, Burt Reynolds. I mean, how old are you, Yuval?
I'm 43.
Okay. So we're the same age. And you remember all that chest hair, Magnum PI, that was the epitome of manliness, was chest hair. I can't remember the last time I saw
Connery.
What?
Sean Connery.
Yeah, of course. Hairy dudes,
Mm-hmm.
And today you got Channing Tatum and, all the other heartthrobs, Justin Bieber, and they don't have a a follicle on their body. So it's interesting to see that,
Yeah, and we do see historically and geographically that the things vary, but we only recently have this kind of Photoshop and surgical augmentation that we have today.
Right.
So we'll see where that goes.
Well, because as you were saying, it's like we can't possibly expect society to even hear us, let alone change. It's probably just going to get worse and worse and worse, right?
And today we have a situation where the ideal female body is different body when the woman is clothed in a magazine like Vogue, or when the woman is naked in a magazine like Playboy. Those are different types of women.
Yeah, completely.
Which is insane.
Yeah. Does this have to do with race preference too in sex?
It might be, and of course you have to remember that you sometimes have negative assortative mating, so people are attracted to something that's exotic, and it could be that some of the imprinting is flexible, that it's like phobias, that it's changeable, and others it's not. So, but it could also be part of race preference, and there are people who are attracted or unattracted to certain races, and also certain accents, which are surprisingly sexual. Might think that if I'm unattracted to a certain race, I might be racist, but you might not be.
Right. I mean, certainly racism plays a part in all of that, and in what we're exposed to, like in the United States, and I'm guessing in a lot of Western societies, the racism against Black people is strong enough so that pornography or depiction or models, Black models or Black pornography actors and actresses are not hired and not preferred, and so therefore it just creates this imprinting and culture around seeing particular people of different races as more or less sexual depending on their race, right? Or a different kind of sexuality. A thing that Asian people sometimes complain about, Asian men, is that they're seen as feminine. And they're seen as not very macho, even though the 2.5 billion Asians on the planet, some of them are the most macho people you've ever met,
Yeah.
But in America, anyway, the United States, they're seen as nerds, good at math, the model minority, and that's not associated with what we consider to be masculine.
Mm-hmm.
And they will complain about always being put into the friend zone because they're seen in a certain way, and
yeah.
I have Asian
and Asian women sometimes have the opposite
right
complaint. Yeah.
Right. They're over sexualized,
Mm-hmm.
and anyway. Yeah. I also, it makes me also think about MILF, mother I'd like to, F, pornography. If I remember right, a couple years ago, or I don't know, a year ago, I was looking at statistics on pornography search terms that were the most popular. And I believe like MILF is like frequently one of the most popular.
Yeah. And incest things.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's a whole other kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But the MILF pornography is an older woman, or what's perceived as an older woman, And so you wonder about the imprinting of young heterosexual men who grow up without any stimuli, as you're saying, of other kinds of sex, and their primary sexual object is their mother, seeing their mother undress, or just being in contact with their mother's body. And then later on in life, they have a preference for older women, women who are mothers.
Yeah. Or the mother's friends or aunts or.
Right.
Yeah. So in this book, the Who Has Been Sleeping in Your Head by Brett Carr, which is he did a huge survey of thousands of people where it's sort of completing the Kinsey survey. So Kinsey asked people about what they do, but he didn't ask them about what they think about. And in this big survey, he only asks what people think about. And the variation is unbelievable. But he has a chapter where it's a list of sexual fantasies that it's unclear whether the person is straight or gay. So it's I think he calls that one the strap-on paradox. The man who wants a woman to wear a strap-on and have sex with them, is he gay or not? Or is he straight?
Yeah.
I think he's straight, but
well, to me, I don't
going either way.
Yeah, it was like, why? Who cares? Like,
yeah, of course, who cares? But and regarding
like
all
what
of
the
this,
label is,
I'm not judging anything. And
yeah.
there is
but you're saying you think they've been imprinted or have a preference for men, that there's some,
or of it's unclear how they got to it, but somehow they got imprinted on that,
right?
apparently.
Wanting to be penetrated
with a phallus,
right,
by a woman.
Yeah.
And there's a term, I think that's from Savage. He's a columnist, sexual sex columnist.
Yeah, Dan Savage. He's here in Seattle.
Yeah. So I think that's his term is kink karma, and the way it goes is that the person who breaks up with his significant other because they tell him about their foot fetish, they're going to end up with a significant other that doesn't tell them about their dog do fetish or something a lot worse.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, you should be completely non-judgmental about this if it's imprinting, as I think it is.
Well, and there's zero harm in a man having a wife or partner, woman, who puts on a strap on and has sex with him. I mean, it's just, we've all seen Deadpool. That's what he was into.
That's right. Or they try it out, I think, or something.
Yeah. No, I think it was, because I think in 1 and 2, he he liked that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. So is there any part of this we didn't get to in terms of your theory?
No, I think we, And I mentioned, some of this stuff was said before, but a lot of it was not. So, if anybody wants to write an academic article, you just, give me a little credit or something. But I'm happy to. I think a lot of people really would benefit from understanding this.
And it's called sexual imprinting?
Yeah, sexual imprinting is and those are the famous animal experiments, usually birds.
Yeah. And it's a well-known phenomenon among animals, obviously.
Yeah. And with pandas, right? That there was pandas that didn't want to have sex with each other, but they were sexually attracted to human caregivers. So there was that aspect where it was also sort of came up.
Right, because with pandas, it was this huge concern as their numbers are dwindling and their sexual, I can't remember the exact terms, but they have, in the wild, they have a very short window of ovulation, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And the sexual mating process is pretty tenuous even in the wild. And they were having a really hard time getting pandas in captivity to not only have sex, but also to get pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would be concerned. and because they're so delicate and so, they're so few in number, I'm guessing that these caregivers would, as humans, okay, well, when they're babies, we need to take care of them because we need to make sure that they live, because we can't leave them to the chance of their real parents because they might not pay attention to them.
Yeah, or if the baby was abandoned, or if the mother dies, or then they'll get rescued and end up in a zoo.
Right. And so, we'll take care of it, and make it, and it'll live, but it'll have a human fetish.
Yeah.
So is it an accepted phenomenon in the evolutionary psychology and all of its ancillary associated schools of thought?
Well, as I said, imprinting in general is an interesting mixture of nature and nurture. So it's yet one in a long list of examples where the distinction between nature and nurture is doesn't work and actually misleads. So one of the examples is imprinting, and there's the experiments are not ambiguous. They're pretty straightforward, and they're very easy experiments to do. I actually know a girl that grew up with farm animals, and she put the duck eggs in the chicken nest, and then she had ducks that would rape chickens.
Right.
And so
because ducks rape each other. I mean, the male ducks rape the girl.
Yeah, they're the only animal that we think. There may be dolphins as well, but that might actually have rape in addition to humans, of course.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they used to think that all sorts of animals rape each other, but then they realized that that's actually not the case.
Because it looks like rape.
It looks like
us. Because lions, when they're having sex, the male is like biting the lioness on the back of the neck.
But then they found out more and more that the female can always stop it, and many times they do, and it's not. But with ducks and maybe dolphins, that's where they still think there might be rape. Yeah, so in this case, the poor chickens were raped by ducks who were imprinted on chickens when they were hatched.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, duck, if people out there listening, if you want to be completely mind blown, look up duck penises and how they work exactly. It is one of the most strangest biological forms that has ever been created on this planet. The duck penis it's like a weird curly Q, feathery, and it grows, and it looks super delicate and thin, and and feathery, but it grows like, I don't know how long it is compared to its body, but it's all this evolutionary direction that male and female ducks have been going, where the female duck has been evolving a vagina that has different dead ends and stuff in it. And so
Wow.
the male, so if the girl duck sort of sits a certain way, the male is likely to go down one of the dead ends in the vagina.
Wow.
And not impregnate her. So even though she's being raped, she can sort of sit a certain way and not be impregnated by him.
Wow.
And so it's been this arms race between penis and vagina for the male.
I guess that she does have a way to shut it all down. Like
right.
Some Republicans think.
Yeah, I mean, come on, yeah, that's it. So is it accepted in the evolutionary psychology world that sexual?
So no, there are people in the evolutionary psychology world that still believe in things like nature nurture division, or that the way we evolved is unrelated to the way we developed. So how we changed from a monkey to us, and how we changed from a zygote.
Yeah, that's the vast majority, or at least the most vocal.
Yeah.
It's like they'll explain rape behavior in humans by saying that we evolved to rape people, or foot fetish. It's like, well, I find they often avoid certain topics that are hard for them to explain from that nature perspective. So I'm guessing they avoid the foot fetish thing because
that was not selected for in the savannah, obviously.
Right? Or the high heel fetish. Yeah. It's like, how could you explain that through nature? But yeah, they often will say, well, men evolved to rape, and that's, or gang rapes, they'll explain gang rape behavior as innate in men, that, we likely gang raped women on the savannah,
No, it could be with imprinting. Many times the imprinting is not neutral. So for example, there are people who it's easier for them to be imprinted on humans in general, on snakes, than it is on cats, right? Phobia imprinting.
Right.
So it takes a lot less of a stimulus to get you to be afraid of snakes than the stimulus that would make you afraid of cats, right?
Right, and just to expand that for people who don't know, and I've talked about this before, and so correct me if I'm wrong, but based on what you're saying, and I think my understanding has evolved over time, we're quote unquote born with a susceptibility to a phobia for snakes, but we're not born with the phobia of snakes.
Yeah, that's what it looks like.
If in a certain period of time when we're young, we have an experience of fear associated with snakes, then that are given the opportunity to develop a fear for snakes. Whereas we don't have a fear of, we're not born with a biological disposition for having a phobia of trees, for example.
Mm-hmm. Even though that too can happen, right?
Right, but you'd have to have
just the stimulus needs to be needs to be more significant. Now, of course, phobias do run in families, and the chance that you will have a phobia is maybe determined in part by your parents, but what the content looks like it's not related to the parents, but and except they said maybe needles. But many times the kid becomes imprinted on the phobia because he sees his parents being afraid of something.
Right.
So if you see your parents afraid of a snake or of a dog, you might be imprinted because of their fear. And that looks like you inherited the fear of dogs from them, but it's not. You just were imprinted.
Well, you did. You half did and half didn't, right?
But it wasn't genetic inheritance. Yeah, right. You did inherit it, but the inheritance was cultural inheritance.
Yeah. For me, for the sort of slam dunk on this for me is that when I grew up in the woods, and there were snakes and spiders and bugs and all sorts of critters, and I have no phobia. Like you could put 20 spiders on my arms and I'd be like, spiders, and snakes too. Like I know some snakes can kill you, and I guess I know some spiders can kill you, but I just, so I can be preserving and, it's not like I'm illogical or something, but if a spider lands on me or there's a spider in my house or something, like it doesn't get to me at all.
Yeah. But it could be that you don't have any disposition to phobias at all. Are your parents phobic?
I mean, they lived with me in the woods, so no, not to spiders anyway.
Heights, or I mean,
my mom doesn't like animals touching her, so I'd call my mom mildly phobic.
Maybe, yeah. So in my family, my mother has phobias. My sister, my father and brother don't. But I know that when I was 5, my brother was born, and because of that, my parents didn't do a bug spray in the house. And there are cockroaches. And I remember my sister, when I was a little kid, telling me that they climb on me when I'm asleep. And until today, I have somewhat of a phobia of cockroaches.
Just of cockroaches.
Yeah. Now, I don't think that they're going to harm me in any way. I'm fully aware of the irrationality of the fear, but there it is.
But not other bugs, just cockroaches.
Yeah, just cockroaches.
Is that why you moved to Boulder? Because there's no cockroaches in Boulder?
No.
Because there aren't any cockroaches, to my knowledge, in Boulder, Colorado.
No, there might be in some buildings that they live in the building, but but they don't. They can't survive the winters. So.
Yeah, they're not in Seattle either. The very few times that I've seen them in Seattle, it's downtown in a very, dirty city environment.
And they're probably generations living within the same building or something.
Right. Yeah. One time it was in a Japanese restaurant. I saw and they were tiny. They were like, I don't know, like a millimeter long cockroaches that were climbing up the wall in this one trail. It was like they were on some sort of wagon train or some kind. And then another time, I was a security guard downtown Seattle, and I had to roam this building to make sure everything's okay. And I went to the bowels of this old building downtown Seattle, Pioneer Square, and I opened this door and I flip on this light, and I had no idea what I had seen because I'd never seen big cockroaches before. But it took me like 10 seconds to process what I had seen. But what I had seen was there was a sandwich in the middle of the floor, and there were hundreds of cockroaches. This might freak you out, by the way.
Yeah. Well, I'm not that bad.
Hundreds of cockroaches eating this sandwich. And when I flipped on the light, they all ran for cover. And I flip on the light and I just see all this movement. I'm like, and then nothing, And then I'm like, what? Did I just hallucinate or something? Because they move fast, man. Cockroaches are fast when they want to be.
They can fly too.
They could fly too, and they were different sizes. There were the big ones and the small ones, and
So it's. I used to be worse, but it's getting better, and today it's pretty mild.
Yeah.
But phobias, you can get rid of them, right, with using.
I've talked about on the podcast. I had a phobia, PTSD around medical procedures that developed. I don't know, when I was 30-ish or something, and it was intense, and it took me 10, 15 years to slowly expose myself, ever so slowly to those, stimuli, to habituate to it. But for the first, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, I didn't even want to work on it at all because it was so terrifying.
Wow.
It took a while for me to actually, I've got to get over this because I'm getting older. I'm going to be.
And there are people who come to America and they say, when a kid gets a shot in America, then they spray him with, anesthesia, they numb the place. And there's a lot of focus on not causing any pain. And some people belittle that and they say, they're all, why are they so weak? But I think that's really important because people will develop phobias of doctors, and that kills you. People die because they have phobias of doctors. So it's important not to traumatize 5-year-old or 3-year-old with young kids as little as possible.
Well, to me, and I'm not an expert on this, but my impression of the action of say, giving a young child a vaccine is to have a physician or whoever is administering it be someone who really understands children and, distracts them or is happy and like, hey, we're going to do this. It might hurt a little bit, but it's okay, and just, all it's
and
not
the
necessarily
parent is close by.
Yeah, not necessarily the pain. It's like the way we often do these things is like, okay, we're going to go into this very scary room with all these scary noises and bottles of God knows what. And there's going to be a scary stranger who's going to like,
and the parent is going to be really tense and expecting you to be traumatized. So you're going to catch it, emotional contagion from them.
Right. And the kid is trapped because there's no flexibility there. Right. And you add all those things up and, you rinse and repeat that a few times at the age of 4 and you're going to hate needles.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, it's so interesting to think about all the different ways in which we as humans have a combination of nature and nurture, and how we as a society and many scientists just completely misunderstand that.
Yeah, so that's why, I'm all about returning to Aristotle, where everything important is habits, not acts, not rules, habits, which habits are all about being neither nature nor nurture, right? It's Blaise Pascal said it's human nature to have second nature.
Right.
So it's our first nature is to have a second nature. And so,
our first nature is to sexually imprint on whatever is put before us.
And that becomes second nature.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, ducks don't have that, but you wonder, if ducks had a society, right? And maybe that's what that whole, pithy statement means, is because of a society and culture and abstract thinking, we have choices in terms of what we expose ourselves to and our children to.
Yeah. And an interesting example from evolution about this is songbirds, that the female songbirds, when they're babies, they hear their father's song, right? Because the father plays a role in raising them, and they get imprinted on those songs.
Wow.
And if you take orphans that, and you raise them separately where they're never imprinted, they don't hear the songs, they have horrible songs that nobody wants to, nobody's interested in them.
Yeah.
But they do get their father's song normally, in normal situations, and then they would elaborate on it, or they would add. So it's an interesting place where you still have imprinting. It's not full sexual imprinting, right? Because they still may be attracted to their own species, but the song imprinting is very, very clear.
Yeah, and it's not as if they don't sing at all. They have an instinct to sing, but it's just horrible. I talked about Justin Bieber earlier. I have no idea. I haven't looked into his life. I'm very unaware of his life. But one of the questions that a lot of people had, I don't know, 10 years ago or something, was why Justin Bieber became what a lot of people thought of to be a douchebag. Because when he was young, and starting his career, he was this cute, innocent seeming, floppy blonde-haired kid. Mm-hmm. And then as soon as he had a chance to express himself, as he became 18, 19, he became, this tough, and he's small, but he's like trying to be muscly, and he has all these tattoos, and he takes his shirt off a lot. And, there's just this sort of total shift in, and maybe it was some decision that him and his, marketing agents figured out. You're an adult now. You got to be tough. I don't know. But a lot of his fans and a lot of society turned on him at that point, because it was like, why is he being so, hyper masculine when his image and the way he looks is just so different, And I was confused by it too, mildly. And then I learned that his dad was hyper masculine in this way. And I could be wrong about all this, but I remember a long time ago thinking, when he was growing up, I didn't have this term, but he was imprinted in terms of masculinity and sexuality by his father. And once he had a chance to be old enough to actually be like his father, then he actually became his father.
Yeah, so this might not be classical the way we use imprinting, because for imprinting, there needs to be a sensitive period. So it needs to be a point, an age where you're a lot more affected by it than at other ages. And this might have been just a general milieu.
General learning about masculinity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But, you could imagine when Bieber
Sure.
was 4 and his dad was walking around the house and looking a certain way, then that would, that would affect things.
Yeah. Or watching media, it might be masculine debate. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it just seems to have. So was Freud right in that we all want to have sex with our parents?
No. I don't think. That theory is based on the assumption that our development copies our evolutionary history. So that how when we're fetuses or embryos, we start out looking like a bacteria, and after that we look like a tadpole, and after that we look like a fish, and after that we look like a mouse, and after, right?
Yeah.
So they thought that we're actually going through evolution, but we're not.
Right.
But that a lot of his theory is based on that assumption that is today completely. But yeah, we don't. We're not sexual in a regular sexual way as kids. So it's.
But it seems related. In a sort of a 3% way or something, in that we are looking towards our parents as examples. We're born with a mechanism to look outwards for examples of sexuality.
Yeah, but I think if it's imprinting, then it shows up at age 3, 4, 5, 6, whenever it does, but it's not there before.
Right. But the notion of the Oedipus or the Electra complex, if there's a ring of truth to it, although most of it is not supported by science or observation, or what most people would consider to be established or consensus around evolution and development of children. But the notion of that, which was quite controversial to this day, I guess, particularly at the time, that a young girl looks to her dad in a sexual manner. A young boy looks to his mom in a sexual manner.
Yeah, this is also a problem with attachment theory, that there is this assumption that we raise our children the way chimpanzees do, which is where the child is always with the mother. But humans are collective breeders. We have alloparents, we have grandparents, we have aunts, we have friends of the family. A kid is not just exposed to his mother and father at all. And it's really bad if they are.
Right.
So it could be that it's the female presence or the male presence when you're young, but the female and male presence is a lot more than just your father and mother.
Right. The way Freud talked about it, he was narcissistically and, jumping the gun on some very firm ideas. He didn't state it as such. But you have to wonder if he knew what we know today, if he would have modified things. But at the time, right, the primary female person in a child's life was their mom, because of the way that societies were set up back then, I guess. And so maybe that's what he was talking about. But the idea is the same in term and not doesn't fit within Victorian mores, which is that one, children are developing sexually, which is abhorrent to a lot of people, and two, that the children are actually looking at adults for information. They have an instinct to look towards adults for information around sexuality. And so, one could argue that Freud had those tenets. However he got to them, if it was completely misguided, and of course, the broader context of the whole thing is rather silly. Most people agree that Freud must have been attracted to his mom, because he was pretty adamant about it.
Well, he also, I think in a footnote somewhere, says that we're naturally homosexuals, and then we turn into heterosexuals later.
Right. Yeah.
The natural state is homosexual state.
Well, it was an immature state, is the way he saw it, and to mature is to become heterosexual. So anyway,
yeah,
I'm drawing that connection. I don't know if it makes any sense.
Yeah, well, and that childhood affects our sexuality, I think, which is, I guess, Freud's one of his contributions is where this is at. So.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. All right. Any last words, Yuval?
No, I think did a pretty thorough job on this, or maybe, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, out there, let us know what you think. You can email me at contact@psychologyinseattle.com. You can email Yuval Laor at yuvallaor@gmail.com, correct?
That's right.
So
And it's the L-A and then the O. There is no A followed by O. It doesn't show up in English too much, or at all.
Right.
Just
it's like Laos.
The country of Laos. Yeah. So it's Laor.
Yeah. Yuval. How do you pronounce your last name?
Laor.
Laor.
But that's with an Israeli accent.
So you don't do the R. It's not a hard R at the end. Laor. Like a kind of dot.
No, it can be different accents, but yeah, it's in America it's the American R. So
yeah, Laor.
Which I'm not that good at.
Yeah. Yeah, my last name in Japan is pronounced Honda. And so
is that how the car is pronounced as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but we Americanize it for the sake of everyone. It's Honda.
Yeah. I mean, my parents chose Laor because they couldn't stay Lieberman for whatever reason. But now I can't go back to Lieberman because I'm very critical of the Liebermans in the, in popular, or Senator Lieberman stuff.
Oh, why couldn't your parents be Lieberman?
The Cold War sent my dad to sell arms to Uganda in '68. And as an Israeli soldier representing Israel, he couldn't have a diasporic name. He needed to have a Hebrew name. And so on the condition he could only go to Uganda if he would change his name to a Hebrew name. So him and my mom picked Laor, which means towards the light. But he wanted to go to Uganda. And it was interesting to go to Uganda for 3 months in 1968. So.
You went with him?
No, I wasn't born yet. So.
Oh yeah, you weren't born yet.
Yeah.
Is that a common last name in Israel?
In Israel, yeah, it's not uncommon.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, thanks for joining me, Yuval. As always, it's fascinating, and
yes,
I always learn a lot, and I know our listeners do too.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for joining us out there, everyone. Please take care of yourself because you deserve it, and make sure that you don't judge yourselves for what you've been imprinted with sexually or otherwise.